The idea of the good. I want to consider the idea of the good. The idea that I mean is the one that opens up practical thought of what to do and how to act. Knowing what to do is knowing what is good to do, and knowing how to act is knowing what to do so as to act well. My theme is that good, the formal object of practical knowledge, or what practical knowledge as such knows. My title collects three ideas of the good. They seem to differ in content, representing different things as the good. And so they do, but they do so because they signify different logical forms. And my topic is the logical form of the good. The form in which good and bad first appear is the representation of means. Yet this form is quickly seen to be subordinate to one that represents an end in itself, and that is life. The idea of the good is none other than the idea of life. The form in which life first appears is the representation of natural life. This may suggest that practical thought is thought of a certain natural life. I think this is wrong, and I shall try to say why. Practical thought is no thought of any nature, and human life is no natural life. This may seem absurd. Does not the human being eat and shit and breed and die? Yes, but to say that this shows that human life is a certain natural life is as convincing as to argue that life is a certain chemical process on the ground that it proceeds through chemical reactions. True, chemical reactions take place as a cell divides, but that activity of the cell lies beyond what can be comprehended through laws of chemistry, and it does so in virtue of the form of its principle. The question whether human life is a certain life, a certain natural life, is not decided by observing that humans eat and breed. The only way to answer that question is to clarify the idea of the good of practical thought. All terms of my title signify life. Life is no term of my sequence, but the whole. Justice and love signify life that is not natural. The life of justice negates natural life, but does so abstractly, namely by abstraction. The life of love negates natural life concretely and thereby perfectly, and thereby it reveals itself to be the truth of life, or the life. I begin with natural life, and I'm afraid I shall end there too, because so you are in for disappointment. Justice and love. I'll only open up onto justice and love, but I have to spend the time that I have on making the negative point that the human life is no natural life. Then the floor is open for you guys. So I begin with natural life, which in turn emerges from the idea of means. We see things coming to be and ceasing to be according to principles, mechanical or chemical, which do not reveal what happens according to them as good, and nor therefore as bad. Good and bad get no purchase. But now I think it's good to do this because where doing this is a means to whatever fills the blank, which thus I represent as an end. Now this thought represents the end as a principle of the goodness of the means I take to it. The means is good because it serves that end. Outside its nexus to the end, the means is some things happening as it does or being as it is. Good and bad do not apply. The end opens up the contrast of good and bad. It draws the means into the sphere of thought of the good. The power of the end to turn something that is as it is into something that, being a certain way, is good, failing to be that way, bad, resides in its own, the end's, goodness. It is because and insofar as the end is good that it is a principle of the goodness of the means. Now that power of the end is not a power to provide a redescription of something that underneath this description remains as it is. The description is a form of explanation, a form of explaining why something is as it is or happens as it does. When I'm cutting a slice of bread because I am making a sandwich, then I am cutting in the way in which I am, therein cutting well, because the slice so cut makes for a good sandwich. So the means being as it is explained by its being good for that end, in being that way. I introduced means through a form of practical thought. It is good to do this because, I said, yet means are ordered to ends outside practical thought, too, in operations of the living. What I said applies there. What outside the nexus of means to ends is something that happens as it does, and it is turned into something that may be going well or badly. Consider the talk of error in the duplication of a chromosome. Now, the defining character of this form of thought is the first form of thought, is the first logical form through which good and bad at all enter. The defining character of this form of thought is that a means is not an end, not insofar as it is a means. To represent something as a means to a certain end is not therein to represent it as an end. If a means is represented as an end, then that will be a further thought. So the end is an external end, something other than what promotes it, that end. Conversely, the means is an external means, external to the end that means promotes. Here we encounter a first distortion of the idea of the good. I will point out how certain forms of thought that I discuss are taken up in ethical reflection as articulations of the idea of the good. And so this will be a form of critique of those ways of deploying these forms of thought. And here's the first one, the first distortion. When we limit practical thought to thought of means, it's actually an enormously important distortion, I should say. Comes up again and again in the most unlikely places. Once attuned to it, you see it everywhere, doing its vicious work. When we limit practical thought to thought of means, then thought of something as good is the thought of it as serving an external end. And that is called consequentialism. In the form of utilitarianism, it has a further side, namely its determination of the good as pleasure. I turn to that later because the idea of pleasure belongs with the idea of life. Consequentialism is no conception of the good at all. And we see this as follows. The end is something other than the means to it. Only because it is other is it able to draw the means into the sphere of the good. Yet this power of the end resides in its being good in turn. And there is no way within the present form of thought to comprehend the end to be good, except by conceiving it as a means to a further end. Outside its nexus to a further end, the alleged end is something that is as it is, and comes to be according to principles that grant no purchase to ideas of good and bad. Within thought of external ends, there is no conceiving anything as an end in itself. Conversely, within thought of external means, there's no concerning something. I'm sorry, I should have turned this off. No, sorry. No one calls me. Why would anyone want to call me? I get it. Do this. Sorry. There's no conceiving something as a means in itself. For there will always be conditions under which alone a means is as it must be in order to serve the end. And when we explain why these conditions obtain, according to a form of explanation that does not in turn provide for the ideas of good and bad, then we do not explain why the means is as it is by its being good. And then the end does not explain, but merely furnishes a description of something that, beneath this description, remains as it is. So, we think an end as an end only as we explain why the means to it is as it must be by that means' goodness. And so we do, and do only within that form of thought as we understand the means to, as we understand the means to be an end then of a further means. So, within thought of external ends, external means, nothing is represented as in itself end, nothing as in itself means. We can retain the idea of an end as an end only by conceiving it as a means, and we can retain the idea of a means as a means only by conceiving it as an end. And that yields a double regress. Regress of ends, regress of means, which shows that thought of means and ends is not sustained by that form of thought, the one I presently consider alone. So, this is what we saw, thinking the good as means. An end is an end only in being a means. A means is a means only in being an end. That is a double regress. It is that within thought of means. Yet we may think that again, and now thinking it not through that form, but as articulating a different form. The good that is thought according to that different form then is this: a totality in which every element is means and end, is means in being end, and end in being means. Every element of such a totality is the end of every other, and is that in being a means to every other. This is the regress returning to itself, the regress bent into a circle. As the chain of means returns to itself in a circle, any condition of the purposiveness of any means is provided from within that circle. Thus the circle represents itself, thus the circle repeats itself, not per accidens, but through itself. It is the renewing of itself. It is the rise and the decline of the phoenix, and every moment immediately identical. I love this phrase so much, I'm going to say it again. This is dialectics. Rise and decline of the phoenix, in every moment immediately identical. Now, with Hegel, I call this the inner process. An element of the inner process is purposive, not through the work of anything external to the process. It has no determinacy outside its purposiveness. It is in itself means. Now, if we call what is in itself means tool, or in Greek organ, then a totality of such means is organism. The term organism is introduced here as a logical term. It signifies a logical form, namely the inner process. Now, the inner process is called inner in distinction to the outer process. And this outer process further determines the idea of organism. It determines the organism as body in distinction to soul. As inner process, the organism is a totality of elements, each of which is means to and end of each. As outer process, the organism is one, not only as a unity of elements, it is one in the manner of opposing itself as a whole to what it is not. It opposes itself to what it is not by acting as a whole, realizing an end, which thus is an end of it as a whole. There is no such end in the inner process. There, the organism is end, which is its own means. Here, the organism has ends for which it requires means from what is not it. Thus, the organism is twofold. It is a unity of organs as the principle of what each of these organs does, and it is a unity against what it is not in what it as a whole does. So it's one as the principle of unity of its elements, as a principle of what each of them does, and as a principle, and as a unity as in being opposed to what it is not, in what it as a whole does. As unity of elements, the unity is real only in its elements. As unity against what it is not, the unity is a reality of its own. A unity of means, each of which is nothing but means, in virtue of being, as such, the end of each, I called organism. Now that same unity, acting as a whole against what it is not, I call animal. And the term animal, so introduced, is a logical concept. It signifies a logical form, the outer process. In the outer process, the animal relates to what it is not in such a way as to overcome that opposition, taking what it is not inside it, turning it into an element of its inner process. That relation of the animal to what it is not in the outer process is total. It is opposition to the other, not difference from something other. The animal has always already subordinated everything that it is not to itself. It relates to everything in the form of the certainty that it is a means to it, the animal, and its outer process. In this outer process, the animal demonstrates the truth of that certainty. Sorry, this is Hegel speak, but I really like it. So, the inner process is a chain of means returning to itself. The outer process returns to itself too, but in a different way. In the outer process, the animal turns what it is not into itself in such a way as therein to reconstitute its opposition to what it is not. The animal uses itself as a means, indeed, uses itself up in such a way as therein to reproduce itself. So the outer process repeats itself like a task one confronts again precisely as one has discharged it. It is the renewing of itself, self-dissolution and self-production in every moment, immediately identical. In the outer process, the animal acts as a whole. Therefore, it is body and soul. A chimpanzee grasps a strawberry. Its grasp, the chimpanzee in this grasp, is articulated. It is torso, arm, hand. I call the parts into which an animal is articulated according to its outer process its members, in contrast to its organs, the parts into which it is articulated according to its inner process. The chimpanzee as a whole grasps the strawberry. Apparently chimpanzees really love strawberries. If you want to do experiments with chimpanzees, you must give them strawberries, then they do everything. So no part of the chimpanzee grasps the strawberry, even while its members move in a coordinated way. It follows that the principle of its grasp is not the principle of any one of its parts, nor a conjunction of such principles. Its members are determined to act as they do, not by any part of the chimpanzee, but by it as a whole. So the principle of the grasp of the chimpanzee, which is an act of it as a whole, is itself an act of the chimpanzee as a whole. Now that act, since it is the principle of unity of the movement of its members, That act is not articulated, but simple. In this act, the chimpanzee is not articulated into members, nor indeed into organs. In this act, the chimpanzee acts as simple unity. The act in which the animal acts as simple unity is consciousness. The term consciousness, so introduced, is a logical term. It signifies a logical form, the outer process. Sensory consciousness is perception, desire, feeling of pleasure. I only say a word about pleasure as I will need it later. Pleasure is the consciousness of the purposiveness of the outer process for itself. It's consciousness of itself as going well. Now that consciousness of its going well is internal to its going well, the going well of the outer process. Thus pleasure is self-consciousness of the outer process, sensory self-consciousness. And this is captured by Kant's definition of pleasure, which I'm sure you have all printed out in large letters and put up over your beds. That's the definition. It's the consciousness of the causality of a state to maintain itself in that state. Paragraph 10, Critique of Judgment. That the state, pleasure, has a causality that acts so as to maintain that state of pleasure, which state, as pleasure, is a consciousness of this causality, which is to say that it is the self-consciousness of that state and its causality. The animal as simple unity is soul. Wittgenstein understood that. On the one hand, he remarks that a soul that is not simple would not be a soul. On the other hand, he says that the image of a human soul is the picture of a human being. And that applies to chimps. Seeing soul is seeing the animal act as a whole. Therefore, we see soul in the articulation of the animal according to its outer process, its articulation into members. Precisely therein, we understand the soul to be simple. That does away with the mystery of consciousness. I'm sorry, this is awful braggery, but just for the fun of it. That does away with the mystery of consciousness. That mystery is a reflection of the attempt to think consciousness through a logical form that is inadequate to it. No description of whatever happenings in animal organs will ever yield comprehension of how it should be that, in virtue of that, an animal sees, hears, feels. For no part of an animal can be that through which it acts as a whole. Ersel insists that it is the animal that sees, not any part of it. It's I say. The point is not only that it is the animal as a whole that sees, but that seeing in particular, and consciousness in general, is the animals being one and a whole. The animal as a whole sees the strawberry. The animal as a whole grasps the strawberry. Its grasp is articulated or body, and its seeing is simple or soul. The animal in its outer process is body and soul. Something may be good for an end an animal pursues, as that pursuit is an element of the outer process and is pursuit of an end only as an element of its process. What is good or bad for an end of an animal, therein is good or bad for that animal. The animal is an end. Now, what furthers an end that does not return to itself, what furthers an external end, is good for that end, and in that sense relatively good. When something is good for an animal, it may seem that what is so good is relatively good. After all, it is good for something, namely that animal. However, that's wrong. What is good for an external end is relatively good because the representation of something as good for such an end does not provide for the comprehension of that end as good. This is a consequence of the externality of the means to the end. It raises but does not answer the question after the goodness of the end. When I say that's good for that, then in that, the goodness of the end is not revealed. The end is revealed as the principle of goodness of the means, but the goodness of the end is not revealed. That question is raised, but is not answered by representing something as a means to this end. Okay, actually. Conversely, something that formally is its own means is not relatively good. The outer process is that form of end. Hence, what is drawn into it, what is brought inside it, or what is made a term of it, is absolutely good. When we move from good for that end to good for that animal, we do not move from one thing relative to which something may be good to another such thing. We transcend relative goodness. The animal is an absolute end. So, the good thought in practical thought, we saw, cannot be an external end. It must be an absolute end. It may be the outer process. Now, there are two ways of understanding the relation of the outer process to practical thought: Utilitarianism and Hobbes. The animal is an absolute end. One may think this means that it is an end that it is absolutely good to promote. Or an animal's pleasure is an absolute end. And one may think this means that it is good to bring about pleasure. Yet this is the opposite of what it means. An end that one promotes is a relative end. The recognition that the animal is an absolute end is the recognition that it is not that. The idea that it is good to benefit animals and bring it about that there be pleasure arises when the logical nexus of the animal and its pleasure to the good is apprehended, while the understanding of the good is limited to it as an external and hence relative end. Utilitarianism reduces the animal and its pleasure to a relative end of mine, and that it remains even while I declare myself the shepherd of the universe. That is the first way of relating the animal and its pleasure to practical thought, as something that it is good to promote. The second way, articulated by Hobbes, represents practical thought as the self-consciousness of the outer process. Indeed, as its consciousness of itself as absolute end. The absolute goodness of pleasure is thought in practical thought, not when pleasure is made the content of a practical thought that formally is an external end. It is thought in practical thought when the self-consciousness of that process is not only feeling but thinking. If the consciousness in which the outer process sustains itself is not only sensory but intellectual. And this is how Hobbes conceives practical thought. And we see this in three fundamental ideas of his. The first is, as he says, that a man, that's his voice, a man only ever does voluntarily what is for his own good. Now that means that the formal object of practical thought is what is good for her who thinks that thought. And this identifies practical thought as the self-consciousness of the outer process. For what is good for the animal is formally that animal's outer process. So what an animal thinks, thinking what is good for it, who thinks that thought, is its outer process. Now second, Hobbes represents it as the first law of reason, the command that one do what preserves one's life and omit what hinders its preservation. Now this says the same as does the line about voluntary action. Anything an animal does, in doing which it conforms to its outer process, is purposive to that process. Hence, in the animal's doing it, the outer process is purposive to itself, and that is preserves itself. So Hobbes' law of reason expresses self-consciousness of the outer process. Now, third, Hobbes lays it down that everyone has a natural right to everything, because everything may be a means to the preservation of her life, which the law of reason commands her to pursue. Now, the outer process is the animal's opposing itself to what it is not, and that is a total relation. In it, the animal relates to everything, and the relation is the animal's certainty that everything is a means to itself, as I said when I discussed that. So Hobbes' natural right, in fact, is that certainty, which the animal is, in the form of a thought. Everything is mine, my means. And that is the form of the outer process. Self-consciousness of it is Hobbes' natural right. Now, Hobbes' law of reason, Hobbes' natural right, are practical thought understood as self-consciousness of the outer process. Its expression in language would be I. This I would be a concept, for it expresses what repeats itself and is always the same, over and over again. At the same time, it would be the consciousness of an individual animal. Now, that consciousness of the individual would not be singular, that is, it would not contrast with you. Practical thought as self-consciousness of the outer process is no consciousness of a manifold with respect to which it is singular. It is solipsistic in the sense that its logical form precludes consciousness of another. In Hegel's words, it is not a consciousness of myself as one among many equally real. The consciousness of the fly on the part of Charlie, our cat, is not a consciousness of something equally real. On the contrary, Charlie is the certainty of the nothingness of the fly, the truth of which certainty she demonstrates in crushing the fly. The consciousness one human being has of another in practical thought, according to Hobbes, is like Charlie's consciousness of the fly. Now, the human being may be more dangerous to me than the fly is to Charlie, but that's neither here nor there with respect to the form of the consciousness. Not a consciousness of another as equally real, that it is not. In order to express practical thought as understood by Hobbes, we could, next to I, use the good. Indeed, the most enlightening form of expression would be a notation which blends the words good and I into one another. I means I am good, which means the good is good. Hobbes' practical thought is self-consciousness of the animal as absolute end, and thus as the good itself. Utilitarianism, we saw, represents the animal and its pleasure as an external end. That makes no sense. Hobbes conceives practical thought as self-consciousness of the outer process. That makes sense. On that account, Hobbes' doctrine is infinitely superior to utilitarianism. Yet, what Hobbes represents as good is evil. Practical thought, according to Hobbes, is the certainty that I am the good. I am the true center of what is as such is for me. From time immemorial, that has been recognized as the expression of evil itself. Yet, while we know that Hobbes expounds no idea of the good at all, but speaks the voice of evil, we do not thereby see how the good can be understood otherwise than as the outer process of life. In its outer process, the animal negates its opposition to what it is not in such a way as to reinstate that opposition. Turning itself into a means, using itself up, it reproduces itself. In this way, the individual animal repeats itself in its outer process. So the outer process is the sustaining of the individual animal. Precisely for that reason, the coming to be of an individual animal is not a term of that process. Yes, an individual animal cannot come from anything less than itself. Hence, while an animal is not made by an animal, the concept of making belongs with the outer process. An animal comes from an animal. And following Hegel, I call one animal's coming from another the genus process. Now, this appellation is apt because the process is generative. It constitutes generality. On the one hand, the process distinguishes one individual from another as one comes from another, yet both are precisely in one coming from the other the same. In this way, sameness in many, generality, is constituted not by an external comparison, but by the logical character of the process. The process, by its form, distinguishes what repeats itself and remains the same from what changes and is always other. The genus from the individual. One animal comes from another, and this means one animal ceases in another. That is but one thought. The animal that unintelligibly gave birth but did not die, the universal mother, would not be distinguished from its genus. Therefore, neither would be its offspring, which would be accidents of the universal mother folded into her process and not individuals. And this does not mean that giving birth and dying must coincide. Yet it shows why there is no obstacle to comprehending that an animal may, in the moment of giving birth, become nourishment of its offspring. Even where an animal goes on to live after having given birth again, the individual expends itself in the genus process, as all parents know. Just as an organ is its own means and is itself good only in and through the inner process of which it is a term, so the outer process is its own means and absolute end only in and through the genus process of which it is the term. Considered in isolation, the outer process is the maintaining of itself of the individual. Yet the outer process is as such a term of the genus process. And as such a term, it is consummated in generation, which is the demise of the individual. Since the individual animal is an end only as an element of the genus process, every act of an individual animal is both. It's preserving itself and it's bringing itself to its end, and is the former in being the latter. The genus process is coming to be and ceasing to be of the individual in every moment immediately identical. No. Life is outer process, and therein it is genus process. Perhaps then practical thought is consciousness of not the outer process, but the genus process. In consciousness of the genus, the individual may transcend its practical solipsism, or evil. We have knowledge of the genus process of animal species, for example, the leaf-cutter ant. Since in the genus process the individual relates to another as the same as itself, the genus process is socially articulated. Thus it will be possible to say of such individuals that they act as they should, or act well, in relation to another such individual, where the meaning of ought and good is provided by the genus process. And thus it may be that an individual animal acts well in bringing about its own demise, and not only in the case in which it brings itself to an end in the act of generation. It may bring about its demise in a form of defense that belongs to the genus, as is the case with certain species of ants. One may be tempted to say that in such a case, an ant does something that is bad for it, as it dies in the process. But that's wrong, for there is no meaning to the idea of something's being good or bad for an animal outside its genus process. The individual animal has no good against its genus. It would be like an organ that goes against the organism somehow, declares its own good against the good of the organism. Now, this seems to be a way to transcend Hobbes. I may subordinate myself as individual or outer process to humanity, the genus process. And then the law of my practical thought is no longer Hobbes' law of nature, which commands that I do everything that preserves my life. Rather, my law is that I do what is purposive to the genus process. That may require that I act against what, considered outside that process, would be my good, but I have no good against my genus. Now again, there are two ways in which one may try to conceive the genus process as the good of practical thought. The first is Anscombe and Geach. The second, Foote and Thompson. Let's first consider Anscombe. Promising, she maintains, is a practice by which people can get other people to do things without needing to apply force. And she describes that as, I quote, an instrument in people's attainment of so many goods of common life. Or as a principle means by which human activities are promoted and human goods attained. Now, when such a description, as I've just quoted, holds true of a practice, then she writes, it is necessary that people should both adopt the procedure and treat this as a rule. She who fails to act in accordance with such a necessity therein fails to act well. Anscombe's description of the practice bears a form that may equally be exhibited by a description of a practice of ants, through which ant activities are promoted and ant goods attained. The ant, or the human being, as the case may be, that acts in conformity with the practice, and thus its genus process acts well, in the sense Anscombe gives to that term. The meaning of act well is in each case specific to a certain genus process. Ants act well in doing this, human beings in doing that, and both according to their genus. An account of acting well here is given in the same form for ants and human beings. It follows that it is not internal to such an account that it pertains to her who gives it. It follows that it does not as such determine her to act. It is no practical thought. Anscombe's concept of acting well, as here explained, is not the one that is my topic. And Anscombe knows this, for she distinguishes two forms of necessity. She says, it is necessary that people, or ants for that matter, act in a certain way, since thereby human or ant activities are promoted and human or ant goods are attained. Yet that this is so, she says, does not show that it is necessary to act in this way. So there is. It is necessary that people, ants, so act, and it is necessary so to act. The second phrase expresses a necessity thought in practical thought, for it is subjectless and provides no space for a variable of which human beings or ants could be the values. After Anscombe has explained that it is necessary that human beings conform to the practice of promises, that turn of phrase, it is necessary that people conform to that practice, she writes, all this, it may be said, does not prove the necessity of acting justly in the matter of contracts. It only shows that a man will not act well if he does not do so. She goes on to explain that it does not help if acting well is sanctioned by a taboo. Not even this, she writes, that there is a taboo, proves the necessity of respecting the taboo, with again the subjectless necessity. Again, she speaks of necessity of respecting, in contrast to a necessity that people respect. Of that necessity, she says, the necessity of respecting, she says, necessary here relates to the good of the agent, not, as before, the necessity that people, to the common good. Now, she comes back to the good of the agent when the practicality of the thought comes to the fore. Now, how may it be necessary to act in the way in which it is necessary that human beings act? That is, how can it be good, how can it be the good of the agent to act as it is necessary that people act? The only sense that so far we can give to the idea of the good of the agent is that afforded by the idea of outer process. And that is ruled out now because doing what it is necessary that people do may hinder the preservation of one's life. Anscombe thinks that a human individual can have a higher purpose than the preservation of her life. She says, it is intelligible for a man to say he sees no necessity to act well in that matter. That is, no necessity to take contract seriously except as it serves his purposes. But if someone does genuinely take a proof that without doing X he cannot act well as a proof that he must do X, then this shows that he has a purpose that can be served only by acting well as such. So, a human being can have a purpose which contains the genus process and is that through which acting in conformity with that process is and is thought to be good. Anscombe says nothing about what this purpose may be. Specifically, she provides no indication of the logical form of that purpose. Nowadays, people here introduce the idea of a value. A human being may value acting well, and she may understand that to be an objective value. Now that makes no sense. Either the value in question is an external end, but an external end as such is relative, or the value is to reside in the life of her who honors that value, making it, as people want to say, rich and fulfilling. But then that value can only be a form of pleasure. Indeed, the values invoked are often quite transparently the finer pleasures of the well-to-do. I remember Joseph Raz proclaiming the objective value of Italian opera. Now, Peter Geach says, the purpose of man is knowledge and love of God. That's better than Italian opera. Yet to understand that purpose is to know God. And therefore the formula does not help us. The formula in effect says that, did we understand the good, which contains the genus process as an essential means, as Anscombe describes it, did we understand that good, we therein would love and know God. That is, the formula represents the objective of this lecture, my lecture here, as love and knowledge of God. I shall not object to that. Yet if at present our inquiry finds itself stalled, this means we do not know nor love God. Now, Thompson. He asserts that there is no step from theoretical knowledge of the genus in "it is necessary that F's do A" to a practical thought, "it is necessary to do A." Rather, he says, a thought of the form "it is necessary to do A" is as such knowledge of the genus process, and vice versa. So Anscombe's step is that gave her so much trouble and led her to introduce this more noble end, this higher purpose. That step is eliminated. And with that step, what is eliminated is God. When thought of the genus is, here thought of the genus is self-consciousness of the genus in this conception. So it's again, like we had in the outer process, we can make the outer process a content, and then we'll be, as a utilitarian, or we make practical thought the self-consciousness of the outer process, then we get Hobbes. In the same way, we have either as a consciousness of the genus process as a content, then it's on a par with ant and humans, and then we need a further step to practicalize it, as it were. That'll be love and knowledge of God if we knew what it was. Or we can think of the genus of practical thought as the self-consciousness of the genus process, and that's Thompson's idea and foot. So when thought of the genus is self-consciousness of the genus, then the genus is who thinks and who is thought. The subject of the thought is originally general. The practical thought is humanity thinking humanity. Now, the idea of a general subject of thought has got a bad name because it appears to introduce a spooky entity. In addition to you and me thinking, there is a further subject, a super subject, the genus that thinks. Now, this notion must indeed be rejected, but it is a weak objection to it that a generic super subject is spooky. You're here so advanced in Ljubljana that I need not say this. This is, of course, totally unphilosophical objection to anything to say that it's spooky. But this idea must be rejected because it makes the genus external to the individual. And thereby it makes it unintelligible how the individual can belong and know itself to belong to the genus, and thus how the genus can be genus. What is it to me if there is, in addition to me thinking what I do, a further subject, the genus, who thinks what he thinks? A ludicrous presumption of that further subject to suggest that it is my genus. I reject that. This cannot be my genus. Humanity thinking humanity is not a further subject other than I. We see what it is when we first consider transactional self-consciousness. Suppose I think I sell you the apple and you think I buy from you this apple. Now this is a thought for two, as Fichte puts it. I know you to think what you do, not in a separate thought about you, but in thinking what I think, and vice versa. So that knowledge, my knowledge what you think, your knowledge what I think, is the self-consciousness of the thought, which thought thus is originally ours, and therein is mine and yours. The subject of the thought is a pair. That pair is constituted in thought of the pair as pair, which as such is thought by each of its terms. Now the I think of the transactional thought, its self-consciousness is I-you think. It holds together in one thought the pair and its terms. Now we can form the idea of generic self-consciousness. Suppose I know everyone to think what I do, not in a separate thought, but in thinking what I do. Everyone knows me to think what I do, not in a separate thought, but in thinking what they do. Then that knowledge, my knowledge what everyone thinks, everyone's knowledge what I think, is the self-consciousness of the thought, which thus is originally everyone's, and therein is mine. The subject of the thought is a genus,
And the genus is constituted in thought, thought of the genus as genus, which as such is thought by any of its members. The I think of that generic thought, its self-consciousness, is an I everyone think. It holds together in one thought the genus and its members. In the first paragraph of the Critique of Practical Reason, Kant explains what a practical law is in this way. A practical law is known to bind universally. So it is internal to a practical law. It is its being a practical law that it is known to bind. As that belongs to its form, it is known in knowing the law. It is not a further thought I have about a practical law, that people know that law and know that law to bind them. Rather, I know that knowing that law, and thus it is right to say unconditionally the law is known to bind. Now Kant says this before he says anything about the practical law. In this paragraph he does no more than introduce the idea of general practical thought. He gives the idea of practical thought beyond Hobbes. Thompson asserts contra Kant that what is thought in such a thought by a human being is a certain natural life. But he is with Kant fully in the conception of practical thought as generic self-consciousness. Yet this introduces an incoherence into Thompson. The genus process is called genus process because this process is the genus. The process is generative. It constitutes the genus. For it distinguishes by its form the individual from the genus, which genus therein is its genus and internal to the individual. Now, the thought, which is the self-consciousness of the genus, is the genus. And thus it is aptly called genus thought. The genus thought is generative. It constitutes the genus, for it distinguishes by its form the individual from the genus, which therein is its genus and internal to the individual. Yet, in the genus thought, the internality of the genus is tighter than it is in the genus process. Here, the individual, namely its self-consciousness, is originally the thought of its genus. As I put it, the I think is I everyone think. It holds together in one thought myself and my genus. In formal mode, in the I, in which I speak myself as individual, I have always already spoken my genus. In material mode, I, precisely as individual, am genus. This shows that the self-conscious genus is not a process. Its generality is not brought forth in a process that demonstrates the opposition of individual to genus by being the continuous discarding and replacement of the individuals. Rather, the generality of the self-conscious genus is constituted in thought, which is the opposition of genus to individual. While the animal genus is real only in the individuals as their repetition, that is not true of the self-conscious genus. The self-conscious genus is its own reality as thought of the genus. And therefore, the individual does not need to demonstrate its generality by seizing in another. The individual is itself genus. It needs no process for that. Genus thought is to genus process as outer process is to inner process. The organism as inner process is a unity of organs, each of which is means to an end of each. This unity is real in the organs as the law of what each of them does. That same unity has a reality of its own as outer process, in which the animal acts as simple. The animal as simple unity is soul. consciousness is the act in which the animal acts as simple unity. Analogously, the genus as process is the unity of individual animals, each of which comes from and ceases in another. The unity is real only in the individuals as the law of what each of them does. It has no reality of its own outside the genus process. In that process, there is no act in which the genus acts as simple. By contrast, that same unity has a reality of its own as genus thought. In the practical thought of itself, the genus acts as simple. The genus as simple unity is spirit, and thought is the act in which the genus acts as simple unity. What is the genus, which is the practical thought of itself? It is humanity, but this does not say much. Since the genus is the practical thought of itself, understanding what it is the self-clarification of practical thought. So we must press on. But we can already say of the genus, negatively, that it is not a certain natural life. It is not a certain life at all. Anscombe describes the practice of promising as an element of a genus process. The form of her description is the same as that of an element of the genus process of leaf-cutter ants. This character of her description settles it that the thought of the practice she expresses is no practical thought. For it is internal to practical thought of the genus that she who thinks the thought belongs to the genus that she thinks. This shows that the genus thought, that in practical thought, is no genus next to other genera. This is it's the same subjectlessness as we saw in the expression of practical thought. There's no variable there for which there could be various values. Yeah? It's no genus next to other genera. It is not a genus, but the genus. In this regard, the genus of practical thought is like being. Being does not signify a genus next to other genera, which is why Aristotle says that being is no genus. In the same sense, we could say humanity is no genus. I must keep track of that. It's like being. No genus next to other genera. We can put this by saying it's no genus at all. That's what Aristotle says. But we can also say it, and this is how I like to put it, it's not a genus, but the genus. These are different ways of saying the same thing. Now, that is what is right in the objection to speciesism. The objection is confused because it comprehends practical thought to be of an external end. Pleasure, absence of pain, preservation are represented as an end to be promoted, and the objection then is to limiting that end to members of a certain species in distinction to others. Why care only for human beings? Is not the worm just worth as much? Not these trees here and that river bank? Why should the fly's pain and the tree's mutilation count less than the pain and the mutilation of a human being? These are the probing questions that the objector to speciesism asks us. Now, thus I open my heart and make it wide and make a home therein for the whole of nature. Now, this idea is a boundless narcissism. She who asserts it, representing the whole of nature as her external end, declares her benevolent will to be the holy center of the universe. Yet there is something right in it. Practical thought is not partial to one species in distinction to another. It is the thought of humanity, which is no genus next to other genera, and in this sense is no genus at all, no more than being is. When we consider the practice of promising as an element of a certain genus process, then that consideration does not reveal the necessity of doing anything. Anscombe recognizes this. The description, she thinks, can enter practical thought only through an aim I may or may not have. Without that aim, there's no answer to the question, why would I sacrifice myself at the altar of the species? Why would I countenance even the slightest diminution of my comfort so that other members of the species attain good and are furthered in their activities. The question is not touched by appealing to the common good, as Anscombe recognizes, for the common good, as it is revealed in the description of the practice, is practically inert. As Anscombe explains, when we ask after the necessity of doing something, we consider the good of the agent. Now this shows the superiority of Hobbes' conception of the good over the idea of the good as genus process. It shows the superiority of Hobbes over Thompson. Since the human individual is for herself genus, she has no genus above her. She cannot bow her knee to a genus. She is not internal means in the self-renewal of the genus process. She herself, as individual, is the absolute end. This is registered and at the same time distorted in the thought of that end as the preservation and comfort of an animal life. The human individual is absolute because she transcends the genus process and therewith the outer process. She does not bring forth her own generality in a demise of herself in which she recovers herself, namely her genus, in another individual. This insight is inverted when the individual asserts her absoluteness in such a way as to assert herself as the outer process of a natural life. And therein we noted Hobbes describes evil itself. The attempt to understand the good of practical thought, the attempt to understand human life, through the logical form of the genus process falls to the ground because the genus that is thought in practical thought is no process. The good, I think, in practical thought is no animal life, no life of the flesh. It is the life of the spirit. The life is no genus next to other genera. It is not a life, it is the life. Is human life, the life of the spirit, another life than animal life, a life of the flesh? Now this is like asking, is the soul another thing than the body? What is always other in the inner process comes to and ceases to be an internal repetition. Cells of my skin fall off and give way to new ones. That's one and remains in the outer process in which the animal acts as simple and therefore as a whole. Analogously, what is always other in the genus process comes to be and ceases to be in eternal repetition. Individuals die and give birth to others. That's one and the same in genus thought, in which the genus acts as simple. The act in which the genus acts as a whole, human life, is no genus process. The act in which the genus acts as simple relates to the genus process as animal consciousness relates to its inner process. The unity of the inner process in its truth is the simple unity of consciousness. In the same way, every relation of human being to human being in which they are terms in a genus process, parent to children, sister to brother, fellow to fellow in work, every such relation is in truth the simple activity of the genus. The act in which the animal acts as a whole is in turn a process, for it is opposition of the animal to its world. The act in which the genus acts as a whole may in turn be a process, namely if it is opposition. Unfolding this opposition and its process, unfolding the life of the spirit, would be to speak of right and wrong, guilt and forgiveness, good and evil. But I must stop now. Thank you.